Okie dokie folkies, so you've got your line drawing in, and this is section 2 where we're going to start introducing some colour to your picture. First area we're going to look at is skin tones, and the first type of skin tone I'm going to cover is a pale skin tone. Here I'm using a picture of a baby. You can see that when I've done my gridding up, I've put little contour lines around the highlights I want to preserve and the darkest areas of the skin tones that I'm going to cover. It looks a bit crazy at the moment, like some strange wild map, but as usual with coloured pencil we're going to pretty much completely erase that. You only need to just really lightly be able to see it. Now this baby is got a pretty pale skin tone, but I would always start every colour of skin in a very similar way. So all the time I'm thinking about where the highlight areas are and the colour, but initially I'm going to start introducing a very pale cream as like an undertone for everything. It's worth mentioning at this point about different shading techniques. When you're doing skin, obviously you want to try and keep it very even, so you don't want any harsh marks. You want to keep your pencil moving all the time. There's various different strokes you can use, however, depending on what type of skin you draw in. If you're drawing somebody with old skin, you can be less careful and even about applying the pencil, and you might want to use something like a more raggy curly stroke like this, because when you're drawing the wrinkles and things over the top, that will help to add to the texture. But for this one we need to have a very even application, so I'm going to use a slightly curved hatching stroke, just following the natural curve of my wrist and sometimes altering the direction, so it'll end up a little bit of cross hatching with the layers as we go on. The other type of stroke you can use is a very straight stroke, and just be aware of where the lines start and end. So for example, if I was going around a highlight, I can use the ends of the lines to outline it rather than drawing a line. Okay, so back to the creamy colour. I've talked all the time about preserving highlights, but on skin, even on pale skin like this, very rarely would the highlights be absolutely pure white, the white of the paper. They would most likely to be this colour. Just because you'll see certain areas as we get onto the features later on that you do want absolutely the white of the paper to show through, and they need to be in contrast to even the skin tone. Right, so I'm keeping in my head where those lightest lights are. Next I'm going to change my attention to the darkest dark areas, which you can see are there, and that little dimple. On this one I'm just going to use a mid-tone. This one is peach, and I'm going to try and follow the shapes I drew in. As you can see, I'm not pressing on, I'm not putting much pressure on at all, because I prefer to build up layers gradually. It does take longer than pushing on, but you get a better overall result. You can adjust the pressure as you're going, or you can keep going over one bit if you want it to be dark. See there, I can already see that dimple is even darker than the general dark. So I'm going to just keep on going over that until it gets to be visible to me. You can see this kind of almost like a dog's head shape there, and that's what I'm aiming at replicating now. You see how I changed the angle of my wrist to follow the curves of the cheek and jawline. All the time keeping the pencil quite light. So there you can see that even though I've not used the finished dark tone to block in those areas, I can now see where they're defined. So I'm always going to have them in my attention, those and then the very lightest areas as well. And generally now it's a case of blending the two so that the light areas and the dark areas blend really subtly and evenly. For keeping your highlights, I tend to think of it as like zoning in. So if you imagine that the palest bit, the lightest part is what you're preserving, in order that you don't accidentally go over it, I start further away and then sort of zone in towards it. So now I'm thinking about colour as well, because like the area just under that highlight is more of this creamy colour before it starts coming into where the peach starts, and that little bit there will be a mixture of the two. You'll just get a feel for it as you go. The more you start paying really close attention to the photograph and then always looking between the photograph and back at your drawing, the more you'll sort of do it instinctively. I'm going to change to a colour. This one's called beige. Kind of midway between the peach and the cream. I'm just keeping away from the edge line because on the edge of this cheek there's some reflected light on her jawline and cheek. I know that this baby's got quite pinky toned cheeks, but I would always leave the pinky tones until the last one of my layers to go on. If you try and put too many reds and pinks on straight away, it can result in the skin looking over flushed or sunburnt even. So I'm always really cautious of overusing those colours till the end. This course looks at each of the different areas, features of the face in turn, but you can see that when you work in practice, they're not separately defined things. Like now it would be, if I was there, I would be going into where the nose starts. I wouldn't be treating it as a separate thing necessarily. You get a feel for that as you're going along. See, this area here is quite interesting, because that bit there is following the shape of the cheek, but then that bit there is following the shape of that little dimple. So if you use two different stroke curves, you're going to get that effect. Okay, now I think I'm ready to start very, very cautiously with some purple. I prefer to use purple in the shadows instead of grey. If you use a lot of grey on skin tones, it can just result in skin that looks dirty. I prefer to build the shadows from pale blues, purples and browny sort of earthy tones like an ochre or a sepia. But we're being on such pale skin, really, really careful about how much I'm using of this. So you can start to see those darkest dark areas really starting to form. And I'm zoning in now on that one, that highlight. And I've got a bit of a harsh line developing there where I've done the purple. I'm going to try and lighten that out. I'm going to be using a little bit of brown ochre, just in these shadow areas now. It's important to take your time, like I said, and just build up these layers really with light pressure. It's better to do 20 or 30 layers than try and put more pressure on to build them up quicker. You get a much more seamless blended effect on the skin tone if you do it that way. As you've probably gathered, I think I could safely say that one of the best qualities you need to be a colour pencil artist is patience, because it's really not the fastest medium in the world. But it's well worth it, I think. Just persevere. Take your time. I find it very therapeutic. Almost meditative actually when I get going. You can lose yourself in the picture. Conscious that I'm starting to use a lot of this purple, so it's probably time to introduce some reds and pinks. So I've got Permanent Red, this one's called. And I'm really just going to use it on areas that need that sort of pinky colour. Just very carefully though. Like I say, it can make the subject look really sunburnt, or as if they've been running around the block too many times and they're completely puffed out. You've got to be really careful of how much you use. Similarly with purple, you need to be careful because it can make people's skin look bruised if you use too much. And I think actually, until I got any more of the features in and could balance it all up, I would probably leave the skin for this pale skin at that. I might even, as I go on, use my eraser and make some bits even paler, but until I would have more of the features in, I wouldn't be able to make those decisions. And it's better to leave it with less colour on than you think you're going to need and go back in later and touch it up than to oversaturate it now. And I think I'm going to leave it there for pale skin tone.